Hello, everyone. It's late or maybe early, depending on where you are, and I wonder, where are you listening to this story from? Which hour is it where you are? And what does your room look like as these words reach you? I always find it curious, imagining all the quiet corners of the world where someone might be hearing a story like this, drifting slowly through the night. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere distant, somewhere filled with dust, sun, and smoke. The Italian side of the Second World War, a place and time often whispered about but rarely explored in depth. Our story begins with a man named Marco, born in a small town on the outskirts of Naples, where the hills roll softly down to the sea and the scent of lemons lingers even in winter. Marco was 19 when the war came closer than anyone could imagine. He had heard of battles far away, in Poland, in France, in Africa, but the sound of marching boots, the relentless orders, the endless paperwork of enlistment, these made the war real. He left home in a uniform that smelled of mothballs and starch, carrying a small photograph of his mother pressing a kiss to his forehead, and a letter from his father, telling him to stay brave but never reckless. From the very first day, Marco felt the strange duality of service. The mornings were filled with drills, the shouts of officers, the clinking of rifle bolts, and yet, the nights were quiet, sometimes painfully so, stretching into hours of silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery far across the mountains. It was during these nights that Marco would hear rumors, whispered among men under dim lamplight. Stories of soldiers who vanished in deserts, of convoys lost to the open sea, of villages burned not by enemy fire, but by mistakes, miscalculations, or fear. Some said the Mediterranean itself was haunted by the ghosts of those who had drowned, their voices carried in the winds that swept the coasts. Marco's unit was sent to Sicily, a land both beautiful and unforgiving. The sunlight could be blinding, bouncing off whitewashed walls, the scent of salt tangling with smoke from burned-out homes. They were told it was a quiet front, yet every day brought small skirmishes. Every night the sound of distant bombing planes reminded them that no place was truly safe. Marco found himself in villages where children stared at him as though he were a ghost. Women hushed at the sight of a uniform, and elders offered a wary nod before retreating behind shuttered windows. He learned to walk softly, to speak softly, to notice the smallest changes. A horse tied differently, a door left slightly open, a dog that did not bark. Every detail could mean life or death. Yet it was not all misery. Marco discovered moments of strange beauty amidst chaos. He would sometimes wander to the cliffs overlooking the Mediterranean at dusk, feeling the wind whip salt into his hair, watching the horizon turn from gold to rose to violet. In those moments, he could almost forget the war, almost believe that the world had not been fractured by politics, by greed, by fear. And sometimes, in these fleeting instants, he would hear music. From a distant village, a soft violin, a lullaby, notes carried on the evening breeze, reminding him of the Sunday markets back home, of the smell of fresh bread, of laughter he had almost forgotten. Stories circulated among the soldiers about Italian ingenuity and stubbornness. Some spoke of officers who had walked miles to deliver food to their men, of medics who risked snipers to tend the wounded, and of comrades who refused to abandon a fellow soldier even under bombardment. There were also whispers of darker deeds. Discipline enforced harshly, desertions punished cruelly, civilians caught in the crossfire. Marco listened to them all, not always believing but always noting. He understood that the truth of war was a patchwork of small stories, fragments of heroism, fear, loss, and fleeting joy. One evening, as Marco and his friends sat around a dying fire, he learned of an old tale, almost like a local legend. They said that in the hills above a certain Sicilian town, a partisan group had hidden, watching the movements of the Italians and the Germans, sometimes helping, sometimes resisting, always elusive. Marco imagined them like shadows, ghosts in the olive groves, moving silently among twisted trees, carrying messages, stealing supplies, vanishing before dawn. He felt a shiver, part fear, part awe, because he realized that even here, in a place that seemed distant from the world's great battles, the war was everywhere, entwined with the landscape, with the wind, with the very stones beneath his feet. Through letters home, through whispered conversations, and through the silence between orders, Marco's understanding of the war began to expand. He realized that the Italian side, often overshadowed by stories of larger armies, had its own texture, its own cadence, its own quiet tragedies and small triumphs. Soldiers were not just fighting. They were living, surviving, observing, remembering. And Marco, in his careful note-taking of moments, both mundane and extraordinary, became not just a participant in history, but a witness. Perhaps what was most striking to Marco was the contrast between the expectations of war and the reality. He had been told that glory awaited those who marched bravely, that honor would follow, that history would remember their names. Yet he saw instead exhaustion, confusion, and the fleeting camaraderie of men who laughed at jokes even as bombs fell nearby. And yet, there was resilience, a stubborn insistence to continue, to hold small pockets of humanity intact amidst the madness. And so, as Marco lay beneath the stars, the faint glimmer of distant fires reflected in his eyes, he wondered how many of the men he knew would survive, how many towns would remain untouched, and beyond the immediate horizon, beyond Sicily, beyond Italy itself, what stories of courage, folly, and endurance waited to be told. I pause here only for a moment, curious. Where are you listening right now? Is it a quiet room, a dimly lit bedroom, a bustling cafe? What hour is it where you are? Knowing this connects us, across time and space, as we journey together into this tale of Italy in a war that reshaped the world. Marco's journey has only just begun, and the landscapes, the people, the whispers of history are waiting for him and for us to continue. The next morning, Marco woke to a sky washed in pale apricot and soft lavender, the kind of light that makes the world seem almost untouched, almost serene. For a fleeting moment, he felt as if the war might be a distant dream, like smoke drifting from a chimney far away. But the sounds quickly reminded him otherwise: the barking of a distant dog, the clatter of equipment, and the faint echo of orders shouted across the hills. Marco's unit was tasked with securing a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley, a strategic point that seemed modest in scale, but carried immense importance in maps and reports. Maps never captured the smell of the soil, the prick of thorns underfoot, or the way the sun could pierce through the thin weave of your uniform and leave your skin raw. As he trudged up the slope, Marco's mind wandered. He thought of his mother in Naples, tending her small garden with hands calloused from decades of work, of the bread she baked every Sunday, of the song she hummed softly as she kneaded dough. It was strange how these memories could arrive unbidden, like flickers of candlelight in a dark room. And then he reminded himself, the ridge was not a place for nostalgia. It was a place for vigilance, for calculation, for survival. The first day was quiet in a deceptive way. The valley below held only the distant glint of water and the shadowed outlines of olive groves. Yet every rustle in the leaves seemed to hint at something lurking, something unseen, ready to strike. Marco noticed subtle signs: broken twigs, disturbed earth, footprints that were almost but not quite human. A fellow soldier whispered that partisans might be nearby, that they moved like shadows and watched like hawks, that one could never truly relax, not even for a minute. Marco wondered about these men, if they were like him, carrying photographs of loved ones, if they laughed quietly to themselves under the stars, if they feared the same moments of emptiness that he did. By midday, they had established a makeshift position. Marco crouched behind a low wall of stones, his rifle resting awkwardly in his hands, the sun relentless on his neck. The older soldiers shared stories from other fronts, tales of North Africa where Italian troops had fought against sand and heat as much as the enemy, where camels sometimes carried messages and where rations were as likely to kill you with hunger as the opposing army with bullets. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Some carried a grain of truth. Marco listened closely, not just for entertainment but for learning. The way men remembered and retold history was often as important as the events themselves. In the late afternoon, a sudden movement caught Marco's eye. Across the valley, a cluster of figures appeared, moving cautiously along a ridge of their own. For a tense moment, he could not distinguish friend from foe, only silhouettes against the fading light. His heart quickened, Yet he reminded himself to breathe, to observe before reacting. The figures paused, seemed to confer, then dispersed in different directions. Some soldiers muttered about scouts or spies, others joked nervously about ghosts in the hills. Marco couldn't shake the feeling that the valley itself was alive, watching, carrying secrets older than the war. Night brought with it a different kind of intensity. The stars glittered like shards of glass over the hills, and the air was cool, carrying scents of earth and distant cooking fires. Marco and a small group were assigned night watch, rotating shifts so that no one slept too long. No one could afford the lapse. Hours stretched endlessly. Sounds became exaggerated. The whisper of wind through olive trees, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of wooden shutters in abandoned houses below. Marco found himself replaying small moments, tiny decisions, wondering how they might ripple into consequences he could not yet foresee. He remembered a rumor circulating among the men about a hidden cistern somewhere near the ridge, supposedly stocked by local villagers who had quietly resisted the war's demands, leaving food and water for those willing to search carefully. Some claimed the story was a fabrication, a way to keep soldiers alert and hopeful. Marco decided it was worth investigating. The next day, he would climb the slope again, moving slowly, eyes scanning every shadow, listening for the faintest hint of water or movement. This small quest, almost a game, gave him purpose beyond orders and strategy, a thread of autonomy in a world increasingly dictated by chance and authority. By the third day, Marco had begun noticing patterns in the routines of both his unit and the villagers below. Smoke rising from chimneys in precise rhythms, the appearance of animals at certain times, even the cadence of footsteps across the cobbled streets. He realized that observation, patience, and intuition could be as lethal as rifles, and that the Italian soldier, often underestimated by history, relied on these subtle skills to survive. He began keeping a small notebook, scribbling observations, rumors, and sketches of terrain. This private record became a companion, a silent witness to moments too fleeting for official reports. At night, around the dim glow of a fire, Marco and a few comrades shared their thoughts. They spoke in hushed tones about home, about fear, about the absurdities they witnessed daily. One soldier whispered about a ghost story, how a young conscript had vanished near a ridge, leaving only footprints that ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Others scoffed, but Marco listened intently, feeling the thin veil between reality and myth ripple. He began to understand that war was not merely physical struggle. It was psychological, spiritual, and profoundly human. Stories, rumors, and legends became part of survival, ways to navigate the uncertainty that enveloped every hill and valley. Marco's days and nights began blending together. Letters from home arrived sporadically, bringing fleeting comfort and persistent longing. He learned to find brief moments of calm in routine, checking equipment meticulously, sharing a cigarette with a friend, tracing patterns in the clouds, imagining the rhythm of streets back in Naples. Yet every quiet moment held the tension of what might come. An unexpected attack, a collapse of morale, the sudden intrusion of reality into the fragile bubble of imagination. And so, as the fourth day dawned with soft light over the Sicilian hills, Marco felt both weary and alert, burdened yet strangely alive. He realized that each step, each observation, each whispered rumor, carried significance beyond immediate survival. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of experience that might one day illuminate what it truly meant to be an Italian soldier in a war that spanned continents, reshaping the lives of everyone it touched. The fifth day found Marco waking not to the warmth of the sun, but to the persistent drum of rain on the tin roofs of abandoned farmhouses nearby. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, pressing down on the hills, and the olive trees shivered under the weight of droplets. Rain, Marco had learned, could be both a blessing and a curse. It masked movement, softened the sounds of footsteps, and washed away evidence, but it also made the terrain treacherous, turning paths to mud and making rifles slippery in the hands of soldiers. Yet, Marco felt a strange exhilaration in the rain, as if the sky itself was reminding him of forces far beyond his control, forces that both nurtured and threatened life. His unit moved cautiously along a narrow path carved into the hillside, boots squelching, rifles held ready. Marco noticed that the rain accentuated the scent of the earth, of wet stone and ancient roots. He thought about the generations who had walked these hills before him: farmers, shepherds, rebels, merchants, and now soldiers, including himself, moving like shadows through a landscape that had seen far more than it should ever bear. During a brief pause, Marco crouched near a low outcropping, watching the valley below. The rain had softened the edges of the world, blurring the outlines of distant villages and winding roads. He spotted a small boat drifting along the coast, barely visible through the haze, and wondered about the people aboard. Were they fishermen seeking shelter, smugglers, refugees, or perhaps partisans slipping past Italian patrols? The imagination, Marco realized, was a dangerous companion in war. It could comfort, frighten, and distract all at once. Later that day, they encountered an old shepherd, hunched and leaning on a gnarled staff, eyes bright despite the weather. He spoke in rapid dialect, offering directions and warning them of unstable terrain. Marco noticed the way the men around him received these words differently. Some with respect, others with suspicion, and a few with barely concealed scorn. The shepherd, with his weathered hands and sharp eyes, seemed to Marco a living repository of the land's secrets. His knowledge of hidden paths, streams, and caves suggested a network of survival strategies that predated the war, strategies now repurposed for soldiers and civilians alike. As night fell, the rain continued, turning campfires into small islands of warmth and light in a sea of gray. Marco and a few comrades huddled beneath a tarp, sharing stories and rations. One of them, a wiry man named Salvatore, spoke of a village high in the hills where local families hid precious books and documents from the fascist authorities, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Another whispered about a supposedly haunted monastery, where monks had vanished mysteriously decades before, leaving behind cryptic murals and hidden passages. Marco listened, fascinated and uneasy, feeling the thin line between history, rumor, and myth blur in the rain-soaked night. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving a crisp chill in the air. Marco's unit was ordered to scout a series of small ridges and farmhouses. He noticed signs of recent movement, footprints that led to an abandoned orchard, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, and the faint scent of cooking fires, now extinguished. These clues suggested the presence of others, partisans, scouts, or perhaps deserters. Marco felt the familiar tension rise in his chest. Anticipation mixed with dread, curiosity mingled with fear. By the sixth day, Marco had become adept at reading subtle signs. The way birds flew in sudden patterns, how animals reacted to human presence, the nuances of footprints and disturbed foliage. He realized that much of survival depended on observation, on intuition sharpened by careful attention, and on the ability to remain calm under the unrelenting pressure of uncertainty. Soldiers, he thought, were not just fighters. They were observers, interpreters, and sometimes unwilling participants in a complex game whose rules were only partially known. During a brief rest, Marco found a small notebook tucked under a rock near the ridge, filled with sketches of terrain, notes about food sources, and cryptic references to local legends. The handwriting was not familiar, but he could tell it had been made by someone experienced in navigating the hills. Perhaps a previous soldier, perhaps a local partisan, perhaps a villager protecting knowledge for a friend or relative. Marco tucked the notebook into his coat, feeling an odd kinship with the unknown author, and a sense of continuity stretching beyond his immediate experience. That night, Marco's dreams were filled with both memory and imagination. He wandered through Naples, through the scents of his mother's garden, the cobbled streets, the laughter of friends. Then, suddenly, the dream shifted. He was back on the Sicilian hills, shadows twisting in unfamiliar shapes, fires glowing in hidden valleys, and whispers of danger carried on the wind. He awoke with a start, heart racing, the reality of his surroundings pressing in. Yet he found himself strangely invigorated. ready to face another day with the heightened awareness that each moment of calm could dissolve into chaos at any instant. As the seventh day dawned, Marco felt an odd mixture of fatigue and clarity. He understood that survival was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and profoundly human. Each observation, each cautious step, each small connection with others, whether comrades or locals, formed a network of resilience, a web of understanding that might sustain him even when orders, maps, and strategy offered no certainty. And so, as the sun rose over the hills, casting long shadows across the valley, Marco prepared once again to move, to observe, to endure. He carried not just his rifle and supplies, but a growing awareness of the intricate dance between history, rumor, myth, and survival. The Italian side of the war was not only about battles and orders. It was about life, observation, resilience, and the quiet persistence of human curiosity and hope even amidst the most chaotic of circumstances. The eighth day dawned with a strange stillness. The air was unusually warm for early spring, and the hills seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for some unseen event. Marco noticed it immediately: the absence of birdsong, the quiet hum of insects, the unusual silence of the valley below. His instincts, honed over the past week, told him that something was shifting, though he could not yet tell whether it was danger, opportunity, or mere coincidence. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and moved with deliberate caution, scanning the ridges, the groves, the broken pathways that had become so familiar and yet still held secrets. By mid-morning, his suspicions proved justified. A sudden flare of movement in the distance, a flash of cloth, the glint of metal caught his eye. Marco crouched behind a low wall of stones, heart quickening, watching as a small group of figures emerged from a grove. They moved deliberately yet cautiously, carrying bundles that suggested supplies or equipment. Soldiers? Partisans? The mind races quickly in such moments, layering possibilities atop each other, each scenario carrying weight. Marco's training told him to stay calm, observe, and wait. Hours passed. The figures disappeared into a hollow beyond the ridge, and Marco's unit received orders to investigate. The path was treacherous, winding through olive trees and rocky outcroppings. Each step required attention. Each sound might betray them. Each shadow could hide a threat. As they advanced, Marco reflected on how much war altered perception, teaching men to notice details that once would have been invisible. A broken twig, a faint footprint, the alignment of a stone. All became clues, elements of a silent language written across the hills. Near the hollow, they discovered signs of habitation. Footprints, discarded tools, the remnants of a small fire. Marco's pulse quickened, part excitement, part apprehension. The area had been abandoned recently, leaving only hints of its occupants. He noticed a crudely drawn map etched into a piece of bark, depicting the surrounding terrain, routes, and possible hiding spots. Whoever had made it had intimate knowledge of the land. Perhaps a partisan scout, perhaps a local villager protecting family and secrets. Marco felt a thrill at the discovery, recognizing the importance of such small pieces of intelligence in a war where knowledge often outweighed brute force. As night fell, Marco's unit set up a temporary camp on a ridge overlooking the hollow. The men moved silently, each aware that even minor noises could attract attention. Fires were small, barely glowing, and conversations were whispered. Marco, as always, took his turn observing, noting patterns, sounds, and subtle changes in the landscape. The moon, rising pale and thin, illuminated the valley in silvery light, casting shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. Rumors circulated around the fire. Tales of soldiers who had vanished in these hills, of hidden caves used for smuggling food and messages, of ancient olive trees that marked secret paths. Marco listened, absorbing both fact and fiction, understanding that stories carried truth even when details were uncertain. The following morning brought rain, soft and steady, transforming the hills into a patchwork of mud and glistening stone. Marco and his comrades navigated the slick paths carefully, aware that every misstep could result in injury or worse. They moved toward a series of abandoned farmhouses that had been marked on the crudely drawn map. The structures were silent, empty, yet Marco sensed that the history within their walls lingered. Echoes of lives interrupted, of meals prepared and abandoned, of whispers exchanged in fear and hope. Inside one of the farmhouses, they discovered remnants of previous occupants. A torn piece of clothing, a cracked ceramic jug, faint scorch marks from a fire long extinguished. Marco felt a strange connection to the people who had been there before, imagining their daily lives, their fears, their strategies for survival. War, he realized, was not only about battles but also about the traces left behind, the evidence of existence that persisted even after people vanished. That evening, Marco had a brief encounter with a local villager, an elderly woman who emerged cautiously from behind a wall of stone. She spoke in hurried dialect, offering food and warning of movement in the hills. Her eyes were sharp, knowing, and her hands trembled slightly as she handed over a small bundle of bread. Marco understood that even in the midst of war, there were acts of kindness, fragile gestures of humanity that bridged the gap between fear and trust. The woman vanished as suddenly as she appeared, leaving only the faint scent of herbs and smoke. Over the next few days, Marco's unit remained in the area, observing, patrolling, and documenting patterns. They learned to recognize subtle signs of enemy movement, disturbed soil, broken branches, faint sounds carried on the wind. Marco noted everything meticulously, recording in his small notebook sketches, impressions, and theories. Each observation deepened his understanding of the terrain and the intricate dance between soldiers, locals, and partisans. By the 12th day, Marco began to understand that the war was not only fought in battles but also in observation, patience, and knowledge. Each small discovery, each whispered story, each careful movement carried weight. Survival depended not just on strength and skill but on perception, judgment, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. Marco's awareness sharpened, his instincts refined, and his sense of connection to the land and its hidden narratives grew. And so, as the sun set over the Sicilian hills, casting long shadows across the valley and painting the sky in hues of deep orange and violet, Marco prepared for another night of watch, reflection, and quiet vigilance. He understood that each day, each moment, each discovery was part of a larger tapestry of experience, one that might never be fully understood, yet was vital to endure. The Italian side of the war was alive in these hills, in the rain, in the shadows, in the stories whispered and imagined, and Marco was learning, slowly but surely, to navigate its complex, shifting currents. By the 15th day, the hills surrounding Marco's unit had begun to feel like a living organism, shifting and breathing in ways that could not be predicted. Each movement of his comrades, each distant echo of a footstep or shouted order, seemed to trigger responses in the landscape itself. The rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind through olive branches, the sudden flight of birds startled by some unseen presence. Marco had learned to interpret these signs, to sense the subtle warnings embedded in nature, the quiet cues that might indicate the approach of enemy forces or the movement of partisans. That morning, the unit received orders to investigate a series of abandoned outposts along a ridge that had been reported as potentially occupied by opposing forces. Marco's stomach tightened at the prospect. He had grown accustomed to careful observation, to walking slowly, listening intently, imagining every possible scenario. But now the stakes seemed higher. A misstep could mean injury, capture, or death. Yet, there was also an undeniable thrill, a sense of engagement in a game whose rules were both harsh and invisible. As they approached the first outpost, Marco noticed subtle signs that someone or something had been there recently. Footprints, shallow but deliberate, trailed toward the ruins of a small stone building. A discarded boot, half buried in mud, suggested haste or panic. He crouched low, signaling to his comrades to do the same. The older soldiers moved with practiced precision, their eyes scanning, ears tuned to the slightest sound. Marco felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mingled with calm determination, a paradox that defined these moments of quiet anticipation. Inside the outpost, they discovered evidence of life interrupted. Charred remnants of a small fire, a tattered blanket, a few scattered rations. Marco wondered who had been here: enemy soldiers, deserters, local partisans hiding from all sides. There was a small notebook similar to the one he had found days earlier, filled with sketches of terrain and notes in a hurried, almost frantic hand. Marco studied it carefully, tracing lines and markings, sensing the humanity behind the ink. The person who had once touched the pages, hoped, feared, survived. As the sun climbed higher, a sudden noise shattered the tentative calm. A shout from the ridge above, followed by rapid movement. Marco and his comrades dropped to the ground instinctively, rifles raised. The wind carried sounds clearly enough now. Footsteps, murmured commands, and the unmistakable tension of men moving under duress. It was a small skirmish, brief and chaotic, yet every moment felt drawn out, elongated by fear and adrenaline. Marco realized, in that instant, how quickly the world could change, how fragile the bubble of safety was, and how quickly the familiar became unfamiliar. The encounter ended as suddenly as it began. Figures disappeared into the folds of the hills, leaving behind disturbed earth, broken branches, and an almost tangible residue of panic. Marco's heart raced, but he also felt an odd clarity. Each confrontation, each fleeting encounter, was a lesson in observation, in patience, in navigating the unpredictable currents of conflict. The Italian side, often overshadowed in broader narratives, revealed its complexity in these small, intense moments. Survival depended not only on skill but on awareness, imagination, and an almost intuitive grasp of circumstance. That night, Marco lay beneath a thin tarp, listening to the distant sounds of the valley. Distant barking, the faint murmur of water, the occasional echo of footsteps. He thought of home, of Naples, of the streets and smells and laughter, and realized that memory could serve as both comfort and torment. Yet he also reflected on the strange beauty he had found. The play of light on hills, the rhythm of rain on rooftops, the intricate patterns of survival and resistance he had begun to understand. In these quiet hours, the war seemed both immense and intimate, stretching across continents yet embedded in the small gestures, careful observations, and fleeting connections of daily life. In the following days, Marco and his unit encountered more evidence of local resistance. Villagers, cautiously observing from behind walls and shuttered windows, left subtle signals. A tied ribbon, a mark on a stone, a pattern in the smoke rising from chimneys. These small acts of defiance, subtle and silent, impressed upon Marco the layered complexity of the world he inhabited. War, he understood, was never only about grand strategy or orders from above. It was also about negotiation, observation, and adaptation, about understanding people, place, and circumstance in ways that could not be captured in reports or maps. One evening, a rumor reached Marco's ears. A story of a hidden spring in the hills, known only to a few families, capable of sustaining those who discovered it through weeks of movement and skirmish. Some dismissed it as myth, others as desperate hope. Marco, however, felt a pull toward the idea, recognizing that in times of uncertainty, even legend could serve a purpose. He began to plan quietly, imagining the route, the terrain, and the subtle cues he would need to follow. The war, he realized, was as much about imagination, ingenuity, and quiet persistence as it was about rifles, orders, and maps. By the 20th day, Marco had settled into a rhythm of observation, movement, and reflection. Each sunrise brought both hope and tension, each evening reflection and quiet vigilance. He understood that the Italian side of the war, often underestimated, was alive with nuance, strategy, and human complexity. Soldiers were not only participants in conflict but also interpreters of land, culture, rumor, and human behavior. Marco's notebook had grown thick with observations, sketches, and reflections, an intimate record of a young man navigating the intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary circumstances. And so, as the 21st day drew to a close, with the sky painted in shades of rose and purple and the hills casting long, intricate shadows, Marco felt both exhaustion and clarity. The war continued, relentless and unpredictable. Yet he had begun to understand its rhythm, its texture, its intimate dance between danger, observation, and human endurance. The hills of Sicily, the village paths, the shadows, and the whispers of the past. All were part of a vast and intricate narrative, and Marco was learning to move within it, to survive it, and to bear witness to it. The 22nd day began with an uneasy quiet. The hills, once filled with the gentle hum of life, birds, wind through olive branches, the faint murmur of distant villagers, seemed muted, as if holding its breath. Marco could feel it immediately, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension that crawled along his skin and whispered of impending events. The orders were clear. Patrol the eastern ridge, observe for signs of enemy movement, report anything unusual. Yet the calm, deceptive as it was, carried the weight of foreboding. As they moved through the narrow paths, Marco noticed subtle signs. Footprints that were too small for soldiers, faint traces of a pack dragged along the dirt, and broken twigs arranged in ways that suggested intentional signaling. He signaled his comrades to halt. The unit crouched low, rifles at the ready, ears straining for any sound beyond the natural whispers of the hills. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity, each second weighted with uncertainty. Then, suddenly, movement. A flash of cloth among the trees, the faint glint of metal. Marco's heart raced. It was a small group, no more than 4, moving cautiously yet purposefully. Partisans? Scouts? Deserters? The mind in war tends to overthink every possibility, yet instinct demanded immediate attention. Marco's unit followed the movement cautiously, weaving through olive groves and rocky outcroppings, each step measured, each breath calculated. The figures vanished into a hollow beyond the ridge, leaving behind only disturbed soil and subtle traces. Marco paused, studying the terrain, imagining the intentions of the unseen figures. This was the art of war on the Italian side, not always combat, but observation, prediction, and the quiet reading of human behavior and natural cues. By mid-afternoon, the unit reached an abandoned farmhouse that had been reported as a potential shelter for enemy forces. Marco's pulse quickened as they entered, weapons raised. Inside, they found signs of recent habitation. Remnants of a small fire, torn fabric, a few scattered tools, and footprints leading out toward the hills. He recognized the signs of hurried departure, of people moving under duress. Marco felt a mix of relief and unease. The occupants had left, yet their presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the constant unpredictability of the conflict. Later that evening, the unit received unexpected intelligence from local villagers. An elderly man, cautious yet determined, had observed movement in the northern hills. A small enemy contingent, perhaps scouting or attempting to disrupt supply lines. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes sharp with a mixture of fear and resolve. Marco listened carefully, noting the subtle interplay between their words and expressions. Here, in these interactions, lay a deeper understanding of the war. The Italian soldier was not only fighting other armies but also navigating the complex network of human alliances, loyalties, and survival strategies that defined the local terrain. As night fell, Marco and his comrades established a temporary camp on a ridge overlooking the northern valley. Fires were small, barely glowing, and conversations were whispered. Stories circulated. Tales of soldiers who had vanished in these hills, hidden caches of supplies, and secret passages through olive groves known only to locals. Marco recorded everything meticulously in his notebook, understanding that knowledge, observation, and interpretation were as vital as any weapon. During the night, a sudden skirmish erupted. Figures appeared from the shadows, exchanging shots with Marco's unit. The sounds were chaotic, sharp, and terrifying. The crack of rifles, the shouts of men, the echo of movement through stone and foliage. Marco crouched behind a low wall, heart racing, firing when necessary, moving instinctively. By dawn, the skirmish had ended, leaving behind the disarray of disturbed earth, spent cartridges, and the grim reminder that war spared no one. Marco noted with a sinking feeling that one of his comrades had been wounded. another missing. These were no longer distant rumors or abstract possibilities. They were tangible, immediate, and painfully real. The aftermath brought a sobering clarity. Marco assisted in tending the wounded, feeling the weight of responsibility, the fragile thread of life in each injured man. The villagers who had guided them earlier appeared cautiously, offering food and blankets, their faces a mix of empathy and fear. Marco realized that the line between friend and enemy, civilian and soldier, was delicate and constantly shifting. Trust, even when earned, remained tentative, and every interaction carried potential consequences. Over the next few days, the unit remained vigilant, patrolling the hills, documenting movement, and navigating both physical and psychological landscapes. Marco continued to record observations, noting patterns, anomalies, and subtle signs of human behavior. He recognized that survival required more than courage. It demanded patience, intuition, and a profound awareness of the environment. Rumors persisted of hidden caches, secret passages, and alliances forged and broken in whispers. Marco knew that in these hills, stories could be as powerful as rifles, guiding action, shaping perception, and preserving memory. By the 25th day, Marco's understanding of the Italian front had deepened considerably. He had seen beauty and terror, kindness and cruelty, strategy and improvisation. Each encounter, each observation, each whispered rumor contributed to a broader comprehension of the war's texture. The hills were alive with history, memory, and human resilience, and Marco, increasingly attuned to their subtle rhythms, navigated the world with a combination of caution, curiosity, and quiet determination. And so, as the sun set behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the valleys and illuminating the distant olive groves in a warm, golden light, Marco prepared once again for another night of vigilance. He understood that the war was not merely battles and orders. It was observation, patience, adaptation, and the persistent engagement with the unpredictable currents of human behavior and natural terrain. The Italian side of the conflict, often overlooked, revealed its complexity in these small, intense moments, and Marco, steadily growing in awareness and experience, was learning to survive, witness, and endure. The 26th day dawned with a sharp, piercing light that slanted across the hills, turning wet foliage into jeweled reflections. Marco awoke early, feeling the lingering tension from the previous night's skirmish deep in his muscles and nerves. His comrades moved with quiet efficiency, the familiarity of routines offering a fragile sense of stability in a world that had grown increasingly unpredictable. Yet even in these small rhythms, Marco sensed that the war had a pulse of its own, one that was always one step ahead, unpredictable and relentless. Orders came to patrol a stretch of ridge that overlooked a small village nestled among olive groves. Intelligence suggested partisan activity had been observed there recently. Marco's heart tightened. He had grown accustomed to subtle signals, footprints, disturbed earth, patterns of smoke. But this time, the sense of impending confrontation was palpable. The hills seemed to hold their breath as the soldiers moved, boots sinking into the soft earth, rifles ready, senses attuned to every sound, every movement. The village below appeared tranquil at first glance. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, doors remained closed, and the distant clatter of a cart suggested normal life. Yet Marco knew better. The Italian front was rarely straightforward, and appearances were deceptive. He remembered the notes from his notebook, the small sketches, the subtle cues he had observed over weeks. This place was alive with possibility and danger simultaneously. His instincts urged caution. One wrong step, one false assumption could lead to disaster. As they descended toward the village, movement caught Marco's eye. A shadow slipping between buildings, cautious yet purposeful. He signaled his comrades to halt, and they crouched low, rifles aimed, breathing slow and measured. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged. A young man carrying bundles that could have been provisions or messages. Marco's pulse quickened. Was he a partisan or a villager? The distinction mattered immensely, yet it was often impossible to discern in the heat of uncertainty. Suddenly, shots rang out from the far side of the village, sharp and sudden. Chaos erupted. Marco dove for cover behind a low stone wall, his rifle clutched tightly. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of gunpowder mingling with dust and the faint aroma of cooking fires. His comrades moved instinctively, returning fire, advancing cautiously, shouting orders through the clamor. Marco's mind raced, trying to process the situation, to distinguish threats from innocence, strategy from reaction. Every decision carried weight. Every moment could change everything. Amid the confusion, Marco noticed a small child huddled against a doorway, eyes wide with fear. For a split second, he hesitated, torn between instinct to protect and the pressing demands of survival and duty. The child's presence was a stark reminder of the human cost of war, of the innocent caught in its unpredictable currents. Marco's training urged him forward, yet his heart held him for a moment longer. In that pause, he realized how delicate the balance of life and duty could be, how war tested morality, intuition, and humanity in equal measure. The skirmish ended as abruptly as it began. Figures scattered into alleys and olive groves, leaving behind broken doors, disturbed earth, and the lingering residue of fear. Marco's unit regrouped, tending to minor injuries and assessing the situation. The child, unharmed but trembling, was taken under the watch of a cautious villager who had emerged from behind a shuttered window. Marco observed quietly, noting the resilience of those who lived amid constant uncertainty, the silent strategies employed to survive in a world dominated by soldiers and shifting allegiances. Over the next several hours, Marco and his comrades patrolled the surrounding hills, observing signs of movement, listening for rumors carried on the wind, and documenting subtle patterns. Marco's notebook grew thicker, filled with observations, sketches, and reflections. He realized that the war was not only battles and orders but also navigation of complex social dynamics, interpretation of terrain, and understanding the human behaviors that shaped every decision, every step. In the evenings, under dim lanterns, soldiers shared stories, some factual, some exaggerated, some bordering on legend. Marco listened attentively, discerning kernels of truth from embellishment, integrating these insights into his growing understanding of the landscape and its people. One story, in particular, lingered: a partisan network that moved silently through caves and groves, supplying information and aid to locals while evading detection. Marco found himself both fascinated and uneasy, imagining the intelligence, coordination, and courage required to navigate such a dangerous existence. By the 28th day, Marco had begun to notice subtler patterns: the rhythm of village life, the timing of patrols, the interplay between locals and soldiers. He realized that survival depended on observation as much as skill, that understanding people and terrain could be as decisive as firepower. He felt a growing sense of connection to the hills, to the villages, and to the silent stories embedded in the landscape. Each day revealed new nuances, each encounter added depth to his comprehension, and each challenge honed his instincts. As night fell, the hills were bathed in pale moonlight, shadows stretching across stone walls and olive groves. Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees, listening to the distant murmur of the village, the rustle of leaves, the faint echo of footsteps far away. He understood that the Italian side of the war was defined not only by conflict but by observation, adaptation, and human connection. The hills, the villages, the hidden paths, and the whispered stories formed a living, breathing network, and Marco, increasingly attuned to its rhythm, moved within it with cautious awareness and growing insight. The 29th day broke with a fragile light, silver and cold, filtering through the sparse clouds that clung to the Sicilian hills. Marco awoke stiff and wary, muscles tight from the previous night's patrol, the memory of gunfire still vivid in his mind. His comrades moved silently, each step deliberate, every gesture honed by repeated exposure to uncertainty and danger. Today, the orders were to scout a nearby ridge where partisan activity had been reported. Marco could feel the tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, as if the hills themselves were warning them of the day to come. As they climbed, Marco observed the patterns that had become familiar. The rhythm of birds, the shifting shadows of trees, the soft murmur of distant water. But there were anomalies. Broken branches arranged strangely, disturbed earth that suggested hurried movement, and faint traces of smoke rising from a hollow. He signaled his comrades to halt. They crouched low, rifles ready, scanning every crevice, every shadow. Marco felt the familiar rush of anticipation and fear, the paradoxical exhilaration that only comes when life and death hang in delicate balance. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the cautious calm. A twig snapped underfoot, and figures emerged from the grove above, moving quickly, rifles raised. It was a skirmish, brief but intense, each second stretched taut by adrenaline. Marco fired instinctively, ducking behind a low stone wall, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. His comrades moved in coordination, shouting commands, advancing, retreating, their bodies moving as if choreographed by necessity rather than choice. In those moments, Marco understood the fragile threads that separated survival from catastrophe, courage from recklessness. Amid the chaos, one of his closest comrades, Luca, was struck. Marco felt a surge of panic and disbelief. The world seemed to slow as he crawled to Luca's side, assessing the wound, attempting to stem the bleeding with trembling hands. The reality of loss, the immediate, raw, inescapable reality, hit Marco with a force he had not yet experienced. Other soldiers provided cover fire, moving swiftly, calculating every action. Marco realized that war demanded not only courage and skill but also composure in the face of unbearable fear and grief. After the skirmish subsided, Marco helped carry Luca to a safer location, using knowledge of terrain and observation to avoid further danger. The hills, serene in appearance yet treacherous in reality, seemed to mock the fragile attempts to assert control. Marco noticed the small signs of life persisting amidst chaos. Olive branches swaying gently, birds cautiously returning, distant villagers moving silently. Survival, he understood, was a combination of vigilance, skill, and subtle understanding of both people and environment. That evening, Marco and the remaining members of his unit established a temporary camp on a ridge, the moon casting long, distorted shadows. They tended to the wounded, shared sparse rations, and spoke quietly of events, some in disbelief, others in grim acceptance. Stories circulated, whispered in low tones, about hidden passages, partisan movements, and villagers aiding soldiers or resisting quietly. Marco recorded every detail in his notebook, aware that knowledge could be as vital as ammunition. Over the next days, Marco observed more closely the interactions between villagers and soldiers. Subtle cues, a tied ribbon, a pattern of smoke, a broken branch, signaled alliances and warnings, silent communications that required careful attention. Marco realized that understanding these human networks was as crucial as any battlefield tactic. One evening, he encountered a woman, elderly yet sharp-eyed, who offered discreet guidance on hidden paths through olive groves and abandoned buildings. Her trust was fragile, her warnings precise. Marco felt both gratitude and the weight of responsibility, knowing that every decision here carried potential consequences far beyond himself. The 31st day brought further tension. Reports suggested enemy forces were maneuvering nearby, potentially preparing for a larger incursion. Marco's unit was tasked with monitoring key routes and preparing for rapid response. Each soldier moved with careful precision, every movement measured, every observation noted. Marco relied on his growing intuition, honed over weeks of patrol, observation, and careful recording of subtle patterns. He understood that survival depended on anticipation, awareness, and the ability to interpret both human and environmental signals. By the 32nd day, Marco's understanding of the Italian front had deepened considerably. The war was not only a series of battles, but also a web of relationships, secrets, and subtle communications. Observation, adaptation, and quiet courage were as critical as firearms or orders. Marco's notebook, thick with sketches, notes, and reflections, became both a practical tool and a repository of memory, a silent witness to the unfolding complexity of life amid conflict. That night, Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees, watching the valley bathed in silver light. The hills were alive with movement, whispers of the past, and the silent strategies of those who lived within them. He understood that the Italian side of the war was defined not only by combat but by subtlety, observation, and human connection. Each day brought danger, insight, and an understanding of the delicate balance required to endure. Marco, increasingly attuned to this rhythm, felt both the weight of responsibility and the fragile beauty of survival amid chaos. The 33rd day dawned gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the hills like a warning. Marco rose before dawn, muscles stiff, senses sharpened by weeks of vigilance and sporadic skirmishes. His unit had received intelligence of increased partisan activity in the nearby valley, a delicate network of resistance moving silently among villagers, hidden paths, and olive groves. The order was to observe, gather intelligence, and avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Marco's stomach twisted with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The war was teaching him, day by day, that the smallest mistake could have irreversible consequences. As they moved toward the valley, Marco noticed subtle cues that had become second nature to him. A broken branch here, a faint footprint there, the barely perceptible disturbance of leaves along the path. He signaled his comrades to slow, and they advanced cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning the terrain with acute attention. The air was heavy with moisture and the scent of earth, and the silence seemed to press on their shoulders. Every rustle of leaves, every distant murmur, could signal danger or reveal a clue. Marco's heart beat steadily, his mind attuned to patterns, inconsistencies, and the faintest whisper of movement. Mid-morning brought the first real encounter. Figures emerged from the folds of the hills. Partisans, moving with precision and caution, armed yet avoiding direct confrontation. Marco froze, calculating options. The partisans seemed more interested in observation than combat, their eyes sharp, their movements deliberate. For a moment, time stretched, and Marco felt the weight of the choices before him. To engage and risk casualties, or to observe and gather intelligence, preserving his unit but allowing the enemy freedom to maneuver. He signaled silently to hold position. The partisans paused, then slowly melted back into the hills, leaving behind faint traces of movement and a palpable tension in the air. The encounter left Marco unsettled. He understood the complexity of the conflict. Not all enemies were immediate threats, not all allies were visible, and the hills themselves seemed to conspire with uncertainty. During the following hours, the unit patrolled cautiously, observing villages and pathways, noting the subtle signs of partisan activity. Each detail was meticulously recorded in Marco's notebook. Disturbed earth, patterns of smoke, footprints, and marks that might indicate alliances or warnings. Knowledge, he realized, was as crucial as ammunition, and interpretation of subtle cues could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. By late afternoon, the tension escalated further. A small skirmish erupted near a ruined farmhouse, unexpected and chaotic. Marco and his comrades took cover behind stone walls and rubble, exchanging fire with partisans who appeared almost ghost-like in their movements. The air was thick with smoke and dust, gunfire ringing sharp against stone and foliage. Marco's instincts guided him, his movements precise despite the adrenaline and fear coursing through his veins. The skirmish was brief but intense, leaving behind the disarray of disturbed earth, spent cartridges, and the haunting knowledge that one of his comrades had been severely wounded. In the aftermath, Marco assisted in moving the injured to a safer location. He noticed the resilience of his unit, the silent coordination, and the subtle communication that allowed them to navigate chaos with efficiency. Yet the emotional weight was immense. Faces etched with fatigue, fear, and grim determination reminded him that war was as much psychological as physical. Each loss, each close call, was internalized, recorded, and carried forward as both memory and lesson. During the night, Marco observed the valley from a ridge, notebook in hand. He noted patterns in village life, subtle signals of local alliances, and the faint trails that hinted at hidden caches or secret passages. Rumors circulated among the soldiers. A network of partisans supplying intelligence, villagers risking punishment to aid outsiders, and hidden water sources capable of sustaining weeks of movement. Marco integrated these observations, aware that survival depended not only on courage but on understanding the intricacies of human behavior and environment. By the 35th day, Marco had begun to grasp the layered complexity of the Italian front. The hills, villages, and groves were alive with interwoven human narratives. Survival, defiance, secrecy, and cooperation. Observation, intuition, and patience were indispensable, and every encounter, whether violent or silent, contributed to a growing comprehension of the landscape. Marco's notebook had become both a practical tool and a repository of reflection, a silent witness to the unfolding drama of life, conflict, and adaptation. As the moon rose over the hills, casting long, intricate shadows across olive groves and stone walls, Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees. He considered the recent events, the skirmish, the wounded comrade, the subtle cues of villagers and partisans, and realized that understanding the war required more than tactics. It demanded observation, empathy, and a nuanced engagement with both people and terrain. The Italian side of the conflict, often overlooked in broader narratives, revealed its complexity in these small, intense, and morally intricate moments. Marco, steadily attuned to this rhythm, felt both the burden of responsibility and the fragile beauty of enduring, witnessing, and surviving in a world dominated by uncertainty and risk. The 36th day began under a pale, misty dawn, the hills shrouded in a silver haze that made shadows seem longer and the familiar paths strangely foreign. Marco rose quietly, muscles aching, senses sharpened by weeks of vigilance. His notebook, thick with sketches, observations, and subtle notes, rested at his side. Today, the orders were different. A reconnaissance mission along the eastern slopes, beyond the familiar olive groves and abandoned farmhouses. The objective was clear yet perilous: gather intelligence on possible enemy encampments while avoiding detection. Marco's heart thrummed with a mix of anticipation, caution, and an unspoken fear that had become his constant companion. As they moved through the mist, Marco observed the hills as though seeing them for the first time. The delicate tremble of leaves in the soft wind, the faint trails in the soil, and the distant outline of a ruined wall marking what might have been a centuries-old farmhouse. Every detail mattered, each subtle sign a potential clue. Footprints, bent branches, displaced stones. All spoke of human presence, whether soldier, partisan, or villager. Marco had learned to interpret these cues instinctively, understanding that observation could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Mid-morning brought the first encounter. From the fog, a group of figures emerged, moving cautiously along a ridge. Marco froze, signaling his comrades to hold position. The figures paused, seeming to sense the observation, then shifted toward a small grove. Marco recognized them as partisans, likely scouting, their movements precise and deliberate. He debated with himself, to engage and risk casualties or continue observation to gather intelligence. He chose the latter, signaling silently to follow at a safe distance. The partisans moved like shadows through the fog, and Marco realized that survival here demanded patience, restraint, and careful judgment. By late morning, they discovered signs of a recently abandoned encampment. Charred remains of a fire, scattered rations, and small caches hidden beneath stones. Marco examined the area carefully, noting subtle signs of human activity. Footprints indicating the number of occupants, broken twigs suggesting hurried movement, and faint marks on trees that might serve as signals or warnings. Each observation added to the mental map of the landscape and the people moving within it. The Italian front, Marco understood, was not only a series of confrontations but also an intricate network of human behavior, terrain, and strategy. As they returned toward the ridge for a brief rest, Marco's unit was approached by a local villager, cautious yet determined. She spoke in rapid dialect, offering information on a nearby hidden passage and warning of enemy movement in the next valley. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were sharp with both fear and resolve. Marco realized how fragile these alliances were, how easily trust could be broken or misinterpreted. He noted the interaction carefully, aware that understanding local dynamics could be as vital as tactical decisions. Late afternoon brought an unexpected skirmish. Figures appeared from the mist, partisans moving with intent yet avoiding direct engagement, firing sporadically to test the soldiers' response. Marco ducked behind a low stone wall, rifle ready, heart racing. The encounter was chaotic but brief, leaving behind disrupted earth, scattered spent cartridges, and the awareness that even minor engagements carried heavy emotional weight. One of Marco's comrades suffered a minor injury, and the group retreated to a safer location to regroup and tend to the wounded. The hills, serene in appearance, revealed themselves once again as both guardian and predator, shaping every movement with subtle, relentless force. During the evening, as the unit settled on a ridge overlooking the valley, Marco recorded the day's observations in his notebook. He sketched the terrain, noted patterns of movement, and reflected on the moral complexities of the skirmish, the tension between duty and empathy, the consequences of action and inaction, the delicate balance of observation versus engagement. The hills, olive groves, and abandoned farmhouses were not merely terrain. They were repositories of human behavior, memory, and resilience. Marco understood that knowledge, patience, and intuition were as vital as courage or weaponry. By the 38th day, Marco had begun to sense a rhythm in the war, a pulse in the landscape, in the movements of people, and in the subtle interactions between soldiers and locals. Observation, adaptation, and careful analysis became the tools of survival, and every encounter, whether violent or silent, contributed to a growing understanding of the complexity of the Italian front. The notebook had become more than a record. It was a compass, guiding thought, action, and reflection. That night, under a pale moon, Marco sat quietly on the ridge, the valley below bathed in silver light. The hills whispered of history, of lives past and present, of strategies, secrets, and survival. He reflected on the events of the day, the reconnaissance, the skirmish, the villagers' warning, and the minor injuries sustained. He realized that survival demanded more than skill. It demanded observation, patience, empathy, and the ability to navigate human networks as subtly as physical terrain. The Italian side of the conflict, often underestimated, revealed its depth and nuance in these small, intense, morally complex moments. Marco, increasingly attuned to the rhythm of the hills and the lives within them, felt both the weight of responsibility and the fragile satisfaction of endurance, observation, and learning. The 39th day began under a fragile dawn, pale light filtering through a heavy mist that lingered in the valleys and clung to the hillsides. Marco awoke stiff, muscles tight from days of relentless patrols, and the tension of previous skirmishes pressed heavily on his mind. Today, his unit was assigned a longer mission, reconnaissance deeper into territory suspected of harboring enemy forces and partisan networks. The hills, olive groves, and abandoned villages would serve as both guide and hazard, demanding constant vigilance. Every footstep, every rustle, every faint shadow could carry consequences, and Marco knew that patience and observation were as vital as courage and marksmanship. By mid-morning, they reached a small abandoned farmhouse, its walls scarred by previous skirmishes and weathered by time. Inside, they discovered evidence of recent occupancy: charred remnants of a fire, torn fabric, discarded rations. Marco carefully studied the marks, noting footprints, the direction of movement, and subtle signs that indicated the number of people who had recently been there. He realized that the occupants had left in haste, perhaps spooked by approaching soldiers, perhaps pursuing their own tactical objectives. Observation, he understood, could yield intelligence far more valuable than direct confrontation. As the unit advanced further along a ridge overlooking the valley, movement caught Marco's attention. Shadows shifted between olive groves, figures moving with purpose yet avoiding direct engagement. Partisans. He signaled his comrades to halt, and they crouched low, rifles ready. Marco assessed options quickly. To engage might provoke unnecessary casualties, but continued observation carried its own risks. They followed silently, maintaining distance, noting patterns, and carefully interpreting signals. The partisans moved with an almost ghostly precision, disappearing behind ridges and into groves, leaving faint traces of activity. Mid-afternoon brought a skirmish, sudden and chaotic. Figures emerged from the mist, rifles raised. Gunfire echoed sharply across the hills, mingling with the scent of gunpowder, dust, and the faint aroma of olive groves. Marco ducked behind a low stone wall, heart racing, responding with practiced precision. The skirmish lasted only minutes, but the intensity was enough to leave an indelible mark. One of Marco's comrades was severely wounded. Another had vanished temporarily in the confusion. Marco assisted in moving the injured to cover, coordinating with the remaining soldiers under stress and fear, aware that every choice might carry life or death consequences. Evening fell with a muted glow, the sun casting long shadows across the hills. Marco and his unit established a temporary camp, tending to the wounded and sharing scarce rations. Whispers of rumor circulated. Hidden water sources capable of sustaining prolonged movement, networks of partisans communicating silently through subtle signs, and villages that alternated between cooperation and concealment. Marco recorded these insights, understanding that knowledge and awareness could be as decisive as any weapon. Over the next hours, Marco reflected on the moral weight of the day's events. The decision to observe rather than engage had spared lives but left a lingering uncertainty. The partisans remained active, their intentions unclear. The injured comrade's pain, the vanished soldier's fate, and the fragile balance of life in these hills weighed heavily on him. War, he realized, demanded more than skill and courage. It demanded empathy, judgment, and the ability to navigate morally complex situations with care and clarity. By the 41st day, Marco had developed an acute understanding of the landscape and the human networks within it. Every observation, every skirmish, and every interaction with villagers or partisans contributed to a nuanced comprehension of the Italian front. The hills, groves, and abandoned farmhouses were not mere terrain. They were repositories of memory, strategy, and survival. Marco's notebook had become both a practical tool and a testament to the intricate dance of observation, adaptation, and endurance. As night enveloped the hills, silver moonlight casting shadows across stone walls and olive groves, Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees, observing the valley below. He considered the day's events: the reconnaissance, the skirmish, the wounded and vanished comrades, and the silent movements of partisans. He understood that the Italian side of the war demanded constant engagement with both people and terrain, that survival relied on perception, judgment, and moral awareness as much as skill or weaponry. In this fragile night, he felt the weight of responsibility, the sharp sting of loss, and the subtle beauty of endurance amid chaos, preparing himself for the next day, when uncertainty and danger would resume their relentless rhythm. The 42nd day dawned in a dim, mist-laden light, the hills cloaked in a gray haze that made familiar paths seem alien and shifting. Marco awoke with a tightness in his chest and a weight pressing on his shoulders that had become almost constant over the weeks of patrols, skirmishes, and reconnaissance. Today's orders were more ambitious: to advance into the valley further than ever before, to map potential enemy positions, and to identify the networks of partisans that had been subtly influencing the movements of both soldiers and villagers. Every step forward carried risk, and Marco's mind hummed with the awareness that danger could strike in any form: an ambush, a sudden confrontation, or the unseen traps of a landscape that was deceptively familiar. The unit moved cautiously along the eastern slopes, careful to follow paths obscured by fog and olive branches. Marco's senses, honed over weeks of observation, were acutely aware of every sound: the soft murmur of a distant stream, the faint crack of twigs beneath boots, and the subtle patterns of smoke rising from hidden shelters. He noted the minutiae in his notebook: the direction of footprints, marks on stones, and the shifting angles of shadows. Each observation contributed to a growing understanding of a complex, fluid environment where human behavior intertwined with the terrain in ways that were often unpredictable. By mid-morning, they encountered signs of a larger partisan presence than anticipated. Multiple sets of footprints converging and diverging across the hills, small caches of supplies carefully hidden beneath stones, and faint indicators of signaling between groups. Marco signaled his comrades to proceed with caution, and they advanced slowly, rifles at the ready, each soldier alert to the smallest movement. The tension in the air was palpable, the hills themselves seeming to lean closer, as if observing the unfolding events. Suddenly, a skirmish erupted near a cluster of abandoned farmhouses. Partisans emerged from the mist, moving swiftly, firing sporadically to test the soldiers' responses while attempting to evade direct engagement. Marco dropped behind a low stone wall, heart pounding, responding with controlled precision. Gunfire echoed sharply across the hills, mingling with the scent of dust, gunpowder, and the faint aroma of the surrounding groves. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the chaos punctuated by shouted commands, ricochets, and the abrupt movements of men seeking cover. The aftermath was grim. 2 of Marco's comrades had been severely wounded, and the terrain had made extraction difficult. Marco assisted in moving the injured to a temporary safe location, coordinating with others to maintain a defensive perimeter while under the constant awareness that enemy forces might return. He realized acutely how quickly control could slip away, how fragile life and survival were in these hills. Each step, each observation, each action could carry irreversible consequences. Later that day, Marco and the remaining soldiers navigated deeper into the valley to conduct reconnaissance. They encountered villagers cautiously observing from behind shuttered windows and walls, their expressions a mix of fear and resolve. Some offered discreet guidance, pointing toward hidden paths and secreted resources, while others remained silent, their intentions unreadable. Marco documented each interaction meticulously, aware that understanding local dynamics could be as crucial as tactical knowledge. The Italian front, he reflected, was as much about human networks, alliances, and subtle observation as it was about direct combat. By late afternoon, Marco's unit reached a ridge overlooking a strategic crossroads used by both soldiers and partisans. From this vantage point, he could see patterns of movement across the hills and valleys. Small groups navigating hidden paths, smoke signals rising intermittently, and subtle signs of temporary encampments. Marco sketched and noted everything in his notebook, analyzing how terrain, timing, and human behavior intertwined. Observation, patience, and inference had become as vital as courage and firepower. As night fell, the soldiers established a secure position on a high ridge, tending to the wounded, rationing supplies, and sharing whispered reflections on the day's events. Rumors circulated of hidden water sources, secret hideouts, and networks of partisans capable of moving undetected for miles. Marco noted the interplay of caution, strategy, and human psychology that defined these hills, the delicate dance of observation, prediction, and decision-making that shaped every choice. By the 43rd day, Marco felt a deepened connection to the hills, the valleys, and the intricate patterns of life and conflict within them. The Italian side of the war, often overlooked in broader narratives, revealed its complexity in these intense, morally and strategically nuanced moments. Marco's notebook had become both a practical tool for survival and a record of observation, memory, and insight, a guide through the unpredictable currents of war. As the moon rose over the hills, casting pale light across groves and stone walls, Marco sat quietly, reflecting on the day, the skirmish, the wounded comrades, the interactions with villagers, and the patterns he had observed. He understood that survival depended on awareness, judgment, and empathy as much as on skill or courage. The landscape, alive with history, human resilience, and subtle signals, had become both a challenge and a teacher. Marco, attuned to its rhythms, prepared himself for the days to come, knowing that danger, complexity, and moral choices would continue to shape every step of his journey. The 44th day began under a muted dawn, pale light seeping through clouds that hung heavy over the hills. Marco rose with the usual stiffness and unease, muscles aching from weeks of patrols, skirmishes, and restless nights. Today's orders were clear yet perilous. A reconnaissance mission deep into the valley, farther than any previous foray, to identify enemy positions, observe partisan activity, and gather intelligence crucial for upcoming maneuvers. Every step forward carried risk. Each ridge, grove, and abandoned farmhouse could conceal ambush, trap, or unseen enemy. Marco's heart throbbed with the awareness that the delicate balance between survival and disaster could be disrupted at any moment. As they moved, Marco observed subtle cues that had become second nature. Footprints partially hidden in mud, broken twigs arranged with intent, faint smoke rising in the distance, and small disturbances in the terrain that hinted at human presence. Each observation added to a mental map of the hills, valleys, and hidden paths that he had been meticulously constructing in his notebook. The Italian front was proving to be not only a theater of combat, but a complex web of human behavior, alliances, and silent signals. Understanding this web, Marco knew, could be as vital as any rifle or weapon. By mid-morning, the unit reached a cluster of abandoned farmhouses perched along a ridge. Marco crouched low, scanning the terrain. The faintest movement caught his eye, shadows slipping between ruins, deliberate and cautious. Partisans, moving silently, likely assessing or signaling one another. Marco signaled his comrades to halt, and they waited, holding their positions in tense silence. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. The hills themselves felt alive with anticipation. Observation was crucial. One wrong move could provoke a skirmish they were ill-prepared to handle. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the far side of the ridge. Chaos ensued. Marco dove behind a low wall, heart hammering, firing with measured precision. The partisans, elusive and practiced, darted between cover, their shots sporadic but strategically aimed. Marco's comrades returned fire, the clash of bullets echoing sharply across the hills. Minutes dragged on, each second a delicate calculation of life and survival. The encounter ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind smoke, spent cartridges, disturbed earth, and the grim realization that one of Marco's comrades had been fatally wounded. The loss was a harsh reminder of the stakes. Marco helped tend to the injured, providing whatever aid he could while maintaining awareness of the surrounding terrain. The hills were deceptive. Serene in appearance yet treacherous, each olive grove, abandoned building, and ridge hiding unseen threats. Every movement required calculation. Hesitation or misjudgment could be fatal. Marco felt a growing weight, the constant interplay of duty, survival, and morality pressing heavily upon him. Later in the day, Marco encountered villagers who cautiously emerged from hiding. Their expressions were wary, some offering guidance, others silent, their intentions opaque. Marco realized how crucial understanding local dynamics had become. A subtle gesture, a spoken word, or the direction of a pointed finger could reveal more than any map or reconnaissance report. The Italian front was not solely a matter of combat. It was an intricate dance of observation, inference, and human interaction. Marco's notebook filled rapidly with notes, sketches, and reflections, each entry a step toward comprehending the complex network of people, terrain, and conflict surrounding him. By late afternoon, the unit had reached a high ridge overlooking the valley floor. From this vantage, Marco could observe movement patterns of both soldiers and partisans. Small groups navigating hidden trails, signals exchanged through smoke or subtle gestures, and the delicate rhythm of human activity against the backdrop of olive groves and abandoned ruins. He sketched the terrain meticulously, recording details that would guide strategy and enhance their understanding of the enemy's behavior. Observation, Marco recognized, was as essential as courage, skill, or firepower. As night fell, the unit established a temporary encampment. Fires were small, almost imperceptible, and conversations were whispered. Marco reflected on the day's events. The skirmish, the loss of a comrade, the cautious interactions with villagers, and the observations of partisan activity. War, he realized, demanded more than physical courage. It demanded patience, judgment, empathy, and an acute awareness of subtle signals. The hills themselves had become both teacher and adversary, offering lessons in resilience, strategy, and the fragile balance of human life amid conflict. By the 45th day, Marco had developed an almost instinctual understanding of the terrain, the human networks, and the interplay of observation and action. The Italian front, often overlooked in broader narratives, revealed its depth through these intense, morally complex, and perilous encounters. Marco's notebook had become both a practical tool for survival and a repository of memory, insight, and reflection, a testament to the intricate rhythm of observation, adaptation, and endurance. As moonlight bathed the valley in silver, Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees, contemplating the events of the day. He understood that survival depended not only on skill or courage, but on perception, moral clarity, and the ability to navigate human networks as subtly as physical terrain. The hills, alive with whispers of history, human resilience, and subtle strategy, had become both challenge and teacher. Marco, attuned to this rhythm, prepared himself for the days ahead, knowing that danger, complexity, and moral choices would continue to shape every step of his journey. The 46th day began in a subdued, misty light, the hills draped in a quiet that felt almost unnatural after weeks of constant alertness. Marco rose early, his body stiff from the previous day's skirmish and nights of restless sleep. Today's mission was unlike any before, a multi-day reconnaissance deep into territory known for both partisan activity and hidden dangers, requiring not only observation but discretion, endurance, and subtle navigation of alliances with local villagers. The unit prepared quietly, each soldier aware that the coming days could be unforgiving. Every movement would need precision, every decision carrying weight beyond immediate survival. As they descended into the valley, Marco noticed the subtle signs he had learned to read over weeks of observation. Footprints partially hidden by foliage, small disturbances in the earth indicating recent passage, and faint smoke curls hinting at makeshift cooking fires. Each detail added to his mental map of the valley and the network of people navigating it. The Italian front, he understood more clearly than ever, was not merely a series of battles but a complex interplay of human behavior, geography, and timing. Every interaction, observation, and choice could influence events far beyond the immediate moment. By mid-morning, the unit reached an abandoned farmhouse perched on a ridge. Inside, remnants of recent occupancy hinted at hurried departure. Torn rations, scattered belongings, and faint footprints leading back into the hills. Marco meticulously recorded details in his notebook, noting the number of individuals who could have been present, the direction of their movement, and subtle cues that might indicate communication or signaling. Observation, he realized, was a weapon as potent as any rifle or artillery piece. The day's tension escalated in the afternoon when shadows moved between the olive groves below. Partisans, alert and cautious, appeared to be assessing positions and movement. Marco signaled his comrades to hold, and they observed silently, rifles ready but eyes fixed on the subtle dance unfolding before them. Each decision was fraught. Engage and risk casualties or continue to observe and gather intelligence. Marco chose the latter, moving with deliberate patience, noting patterns, and silently calculating possible outcomes. The partisans shifted like shadows, leaving only faint traces of their presence. Later in the day, the unit encountered a villager, cautious yet resolute. She offered critical information about hidden paths, local water sources, and movements of enemy forces. Marco recorded every detail, aware that local knowledge was invaluable and that trust was fragile. Misinterpretation or misjudgment could endanger both his unit and the villagers who dared to provide guidance. The Italian front, he reflected, demanded constant vigilance not only toward the enemy but toward the intricate web of human relationships that influenced every strategic decision. By evening, the hills became a theater of tension and uncertainty. Marco and his comrades set up a temporary camp on a ridge, tending to minor injuries, rationing supplies, and sharing whispered observations. Rumors circulated of partisan networks capable of moving undetected for miles, of hidden caches of provisions, and of villagers who shifted allegiances based on survival and self-preservation. Marco's notebook became thicker, filled with sketches, observations, and reflections on moral and strategic dilemmas. Each entry a step toward understanding the complex reality of war. The night brought new challenges. A sudden movement in the darkness, a rustle in the olive groves, forced Marco and his comrades to respond instantly. Shots rang out, echoing across the hills, as they sought cover and attempted to assess the threat. One soldier was injured in the confusion, and Marco felt the familiar surge of fear and responsibility. Survival in these hills required not only skill and courage but the ability to remain calm under relentless pressure, to act decisively while constantly interpreting incomplete information. By the 47th day, Marco's understanding of the landscape and its human networks had deepened. Observation, inference, and careful decision-making were as critical as physical endurance or marksmanship. Each day brought new insights, new moral and strategic dilemmas, and the constant reminder that life in the hills was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. Marco's notebook was no longer just a record. It was a lifeline, a guide through the shifting currents of danger, human interaction, and survival. As moonlight bathed the valley in silver, Marco sat quietly on the ridge, rifle across his knees, reflecting on the past days. The reconnaissance, skirmishes, minor and severe injuries, and the fragile trust of villagers. He realized that understanding, patience, and empathy were as vital as courage or firepower. The Italian side of the conflict, often overlooked in broader histories, revealed itself in these small, intense, and morally complex moments. Marco, attuned to the rhythm of the hills and the subtle signals of human behavior, prepared himself for the days to come, knowing that danger, complexity, and moral responsibility would continue to shape every step of his journey. The 55th day dawned with an unusual calm, the hills wrapped in a soft golden light that seemed almost surreal after weeks of relentless tension, skirmishes, and uncertainty. Marco woke with a sense of quiet reflection, muscles sore but his mind alive with recollections of the trials, losses, and fleeting moments of human connection that had defined his journey. Over the weeks, he had navigated the tangled landscapes of hills and valleys, skirmished with partisans, and witnessed both courage and vulnerability in soldiers and civilians alike. Today, there were no orders for reconnaissance or engagement, only a slow, contemplative movement through the familiar paths he had learned to read like a living map. As Marco moved through the valleys, olive groves casting long shadows in the morning sun, he reflected on the layers of the Italian front. It had been more than a battle of arms. It was a web of observation, trust, fear, and human resilience. He thought of comrades lost, of villagers who risked everything to provide aid or concealment, and of the silent, invisible strategies that shaped survival as much as rifles and ammunition. Each ridge, each abandoned farmhouse, each subtle signal, like a broken twig or the faint curl of smoke, had taught him lessons in patience, perception, and empathy. Walking along a narrow path that wound between hills, Marco paused at a small stone wall, overlooking a valley he had traversed countless times. The village below lay quiet, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, children playing despite the remnants of war etched in walls and fields. He remembered moments of fear and courage, small acts of defiance, and the delicate balance between survival and morality. The hills had been both adversary and teacher, offering peril and wisdom in equal measure. Marco felt a profound awareness of how life, even amid war, persisted with stubborn resilience, in patterns both subtle and profound. During the afternoon, Marco paused near a ruined farmhouse he had observed weeks earlier. It was empty now, but he traced with his eyes the faint impressions of prior occupation, the burned fire pit, the scattered stones, the marks that hinted at human presence. He understood that the front was not only a theater of conflict, but also a mosaic of lived experiences, stories untold, and choices made under immense pressure. Each mark, each footprint, each subtle trace of activity carried meaning, revealing layers of strategy, survival, and human complexity that could easily be overlooked by outsiders or in the broader narratives of war. As he continued along the ridge, Marco reflected on his own growth. Weeks of observation, patience, and moral negotiation had changed him. He had learned to see beyond immediate danger, to interpret subtle cues, and to weigh decisions with consideration not only for survival but for the humanity of those around him. The Italian front, he realized, was defined as much by perception, empathy, and moral choices as by strategy or combat. He felt a deep sense of connection to the land, to the villagers, to the ghosts of the hills who had shaped the rhythms of his experience. Evening fell, and Marco set up a small resting spot on a familiar ridge. The valley below glowed in the soft light of dusk, olive groves swaying gently in the breeze, the remnants of villages casting long shadows. He opened his notebook, now thick with observations, sketches, and reflections, and reviewed the journey he had undertaken. Every skirmish, every encounter, every moral choice and loss was recorded here, a testament to the subtle, complex reality of life on the Italian front. Marco understood that survival had not only been about combat, it had been about learning to navigate people, terrain, and moral dilemmas with awareness and humility. Night descended, the moon rising high to bathe the hills in silver light. Marco sat quietly, rifle across his knees, breathing deeply, feeling the rhythm of the land beneath him. He thought of the comrades lost and the villagers who had risked so much, of the partisans who had shaped the delicate balance of power, and of the intricate dance of observation and action that had defined every day. The Italian side of the war had revealed itself not in grand battles alone, but in these subtle, intense, morally complex moments that tested perception, empathy, and resilience. As the hours passed, Marco allowed himself a rare sense of peace. He knew that the world remained uncertain, that dangers would always exist, but he also understood that the lessons of observation, patience, and moral clarity would guide him beyond the immediate horrors of war. The hills, valleys, and olive groves had become more than terrain. They had become teachers, shaping insight, understanding, and resilience. Marco, gazing at the quiet village below, felt a profound awareness of both fragility and endurance, of loss and survival, and of the quiet, enduring complexity of life itself. And in that still, silvered night, with the whispers of wind through the groves and the distant sounds of a world recovering from chaos, Marco finally allowed himself to reflect not just on survival, but on the intricate, profound tapestry of human experience that had unfolded in the hills of Italy. A story of courage, observation, empathy, and endurance, written not only in actions but in the quiet awareness of a soldier who had seen the front in all its nuance and humanity.